Nonviolence section. The Western Left and the reference to Gandhi in Cappuccini and Dolci. For a long time, Gandhi's influence in the West was encouraged by sympathetic attention to colonial people's liberation movements. The case of Aldo Cappuccini in Italy is exemplary. He summarized his development as follows. Along with other young people, prompted by disappointment at the Concordat and the support given the fascist regime by the Catholic Church, quote, we went back to the very sources of religious life, particularly Gandhi, end quote. The date was 1929, and the Indian leader was beginning to achieve world fame thanks to the Salt March, which was placing the British government in serious difficulties. In Cappuccini, admiration for the leader of the Indian independence movement became ever more closely bound up with opposition to a regime, the fascist regime, engaged in constructing a colonial empire. In the eyes of his Italian follower, on the one hand, Gandhi was, on account of his loyalty to the principle of nonviolence, one of the great, pure religious spirits, along with, quote, Christ, Buddha, and St. Francis. On the other hand, in promoting the liberation of oppressed peoples from colonialism and poverty, he was a champion of the Third World. In addition to the fascism that survived the end of the Second World War, namely Francoism, the condemnation of violence in Cappuccini was primarily directed at, quote, the crimes of colonialism, Angola, Algeria, etc., and imperialism, the pressure on Cuba, and imperialism in Vietnam, the horrors of Angola and South Africa, the substitution of American for European colonialism, end quote. It was necessary to respond to all this with the tried and tested method of Gandhi. Yet it made no sense to equate the violence of the oppressed with that of the oppressors. Quote, the guerrilla is wholly understandable in its origins, where the oppression, exploitation, and persecution of subaltern strata are very harsh. Consciousness is awakened and regards casting one's lot with the guerrilla so as not to languish, not to suffer passively, as a liberation, end quote. Over and above any mistakes they might make, anti-colonial liberation movements were to be greeted favorably and warmly. Cappuccini did not refer to nonviolence to establish a contrast between the two. On the contrary, he analyzed Marx and Tolstoy, and the influence exercised by them in China and India respectively, in tandem. Marx, quote, demonstrating the historicity and transience of the economic forms, opened up the possibility of an economy in which the multitude directly participated as a protagonist, end quote. In his turn, Tolstoy called upon the mass of people to make its active, autonomous participation in religious life felt. Quote, and given that the continent where the multitudes were the most multitudinous was Asia, Marxism had to expand principally in Asia, end quote. And there, too, where the forms of religious life were increasingly ossified, the lesson of Tolstoy, to which Gandhi referred, also ended up having a particular resonance. What emerges from this text is a comparison between Mao, evoked indirectly, and Gandhi. They were credited with having sponsored two gigantic processes of emancipation in their different ways. The appeal to the West to respect the Asiatic East as a whole, in the first instance China and India, is then perfectly understandable. Cappuccini's ideas did not change, even when many in the West began to mobilize the theme of the Yellow Peril. In the early 1960s, he signaled two important facts. On the one hand, John F. Kennedy's Democratic administration was seeking to revive U.S. influence, quote, in a less imperious, but more imperial and omnipresent fashion. On the other, there was the impending Chinese atom bomb, which means the real start of Chinese military and political responsibility in the world. Hence, it may be that American initiative is making every effort to replace European colonialism and be attractive. It may be that Chinese initiative is seeking to help wherever the Western capitalist system is trembling. End quote. Clearly, Capitini was more sympathetic to Mao's China than Kennedy's United States, which was beginning to engage in colonial warfare in Vietnam. The commitment to nonviolence remained firm. It was all the more necessary because recourse to armed resistance by peoples oppressed by colonialism risked becoming merely a subordinate moment in the clash between the two blocs. What loomed was, quote, the possibility of a Third World War, and after the crime of Hiroshima, humanity's priority was averting the danger of a war that would entail the destruction of millions of innocents, of children. This was why nonviolent action must primarily target militarism. In committing himself to struggle above all against international violence, against war, Capitini linked up with the anti-militarist movement that developed between the 19th and 20th centuries. However, the latter had proved to be a, quote, very tame pacifism that did not succeed in preventing the First or Second World War. Hence, if one wanted to avoid a new war, radicalization of the movement was required, with the foundation of a kind of nonviolent international in the wake of the Workers' Internationals. What is identified with here is the legacy of the labor and socialist movement, and it is identified within its most radical aspects, as clearly indicated by the demarcation from reformism of the social democratic variety. The liberal socialism professed by Capitini proposed to inherit the conquests not only of the French Revolution, but also of the Russian collectivist revolution. Alluding to the New Deal in particular, Capitini also called for the strong points of American democracy to be drawn on, but once again without forgetting the October Revolution, with its strong collectivist connections, which had inspired other great revolutions, such as the one in China. The mistake of a classical liberal philosopher like Benedetto Croce was to remain wedded to, quote, the time before 1917, when the American army arrived in Europe, and when the Russian Revolution, which subsequently became Asian, began. An original, variegated pantheon emerged. It was necessary to try to keep pace with the century in which, quote, a Lenin, a Gandhi, and an F.D. Roosevelt had lived, end quote. The tribute to the October Revolution, its leaders, and the country that had emerged from it did not stop there. Capitini spoke warmly of the Soviet Union, which, quote, has proved capable in a short pace of time of tackling an immense war effort through state organization, end quote. How far was all this reconcilable with the nonviolent profession of faith? At least as regards, quote, subhuman beings, the animal world, Capitini's approach was gradualist. Quote, one must try to make 500 even if one cannot make 1,000. Nonviolence involves making a start, progressing, enlarging, end quote. On closer examination, the gradualist approach suggested here possessed general validity. Beginning of long quote. It is difficult to be completely nonviolent. We can find ourselves in situations where we push defense to the point of violence. The important thing is not to tire of trying to realize it, living in its profound rationale. The substance of nonviolence is as respectable as legitimate defense, because both are serious and profound. End quote. Capitini's attitude during the struggle against fascism speaks volumes. Quote, in meeting with young people, for me the important thing was creating an awareness. The choice of violence or nonviolence was secondary. It might be in fact said that the use of violent force becomes almost inevitable when fascism and the monarchy lead Italians into an unfortunate war with many constraints, especially the military one. Violence calls forth violence, end quote. With the subsequent creation of the Republic of Salo, quote, especially in the case of someone subject to military service, and who had no choice but either to conduct war and internal repression with the fascists and Nazis, or to take to the mountains. One understands how the idea came to be communicated to virtually everyone that the new society would be arrived at through armed resistance. End quote. And in a sense, even those who intended to remain faithful to the principle of nonviolence ended up associating with this. Quote, someone stood with the partisans because he had nowhere to go and did not want to separate from the anti-fascist setup, but he did not fire. End quote. Danilo Dolci, who in the 1950s chose Sicily for his nonviolent struggle in defense of labor and development, and against the mafia, appealed to Gandhi and Tolstoy. The nonviolent profession of faith did not prevent him from paying tribute to the anti-fascist resistance, even though it had developed as an armed struggle. In fact, as regards Italy, the main problem, observed Dolci in 1993, could be formulated thus, quote, how has it been possible for the republic born out of the resistance to be corrupted to the extent of its current virtual dissolution? End quote. This is not an isolated idea. Denunciation of the betrayal of the ideals that inspired the resistance seems to be the guiding thread of Dolci's discourse. Referring to the violent repression of demonstrations by the unemployed in a country whose constitution, derived from the resistance, guarantees the right to work, Dolci declared, quote, for the state to kill desperate people is especially criminal, end quote. The nonviolent profession of faith was primarily a denunciation of the inherently violent character of the socio-political relations that existed internationally, as manifested by the frenzied arms race, whose main protagonist was the West, and domestically. Beginning of long quote. The new moral intuition identifies injustice with violence, preventing, directly or indirectly, the development of individuals, groups, and collectives. Inasmuch as the world is largely unacceptable, the new morality, which human beings need if they wish to survive, identifies justice with social change and, where injustice is more serious, with nonviolent revolution. End quote. Such nonviolent revolution is all the more necessary because, on the specifically political plane too, we are dealing with relations ultimately based on oppression. Quote, the modern state, even where cloaked in democracy, is often in the process of becoming a bureaucratic machine in which the government is in fact directly or indirectly dependent on big capital, on the big employers who weigh, through hidden influence and the media, in fundamental decisions. End quote, and end of section.